I was so tired of my stamping inks bleeding through the paper of my bullet journals, even when the paper was 160 GSM, that I decided to find out if there were other alternatives for using with my stamps. Hi, I'm Ruby from The Useful Journal. Subscribe to my channel and check out my journal reviews and my washi tape art. In this video, I will show you the problems I've had with stamping inks in my journals. These journals have nearly always been premium quality and range from 100 GSM to 160 GSM paper. I'll then show you some alternatives to use with both rubber and acrylic stamps and how to get the best results with each. The temptation to use ink is real because it's convenient and gives a nice clean line and isn't affected by colouring in the stamped picture with watercolour paints. I test inks in my pen test in each journal, and if they don't show through straight away, and most do, they show through after a while. It's terribly frustrating, and I have a whole pile of rubber and acrylic stamps that I just love using. The worst case was in my Archer and Olive journal back in 2020. Unfortunately, back then I didn't record process videos and also didn't take a lot of photos, and so I can't remember what type of ink pad I was using with the stamps in this journal. The stamping was fine at first, as can be seen by the photos I took at the time, but sometime later the ink started soaking through the paper and now it's obvious and it has ruined the look of my pages. This has understandably made me a little bit nervous about using ink pads for stamping in my journal, despite stamping inks sometimes working fine without bleeding, like in my Tuck Tea journal. Just in case, I've found some alternatives to using ink pads. Before I get into those, I'll explain why ink pads might bleed through the paper in your journal. While most inks are water-based, they do contain compounds that help stop the ink pad from drying out, so that every time you open your ink pad, it's ready to use. And some of these can be quite problematic. Most inks say they are xylene free, and that's because xylene is a hydrocarbon, which is a bit of a nasty. If ink contains xylene, it would most definitely bleed through your paper. Glycerol or glycerin is a sweet flavoured alcohol that is added to ink in ink pads to stop them from drying out. It also helps reduce blending and spreading of the ink once it's on the page. It's most likely this glycerol content that causes a problem for our page because a glycerol is an alcohol. They're less of a problem for scrapbooking and card making, mainly because those crafts tend to use heavier weight papers that are 240, 250 GSM. I suspect that the ink pad I used in my Archer and Olive journal had glycerol in it, and that's why I gradually got that bleed through problem over time. Finally, chalk inks, and the main brand is Versamagic, sit on the surface with a matte raised finish. It takes a while to dry, and while it works on white paper, it actually looks best on coloured and black papers, and it won't bleed. This is probably the safest option in ink pads for bullet journaling. I just want to make it clear, I am not an expert on ink. I don't have a huge range of types of ink. So if you want to know more, I recommend you do some research online. I just wanted to share a couple of things I've found that work for me. When it comes to inks, I have a Ranger archival ink pad. I also have an Artline ink pad, but I think that's the one that caused me problems, so I don't use it anymore. I also have Tim Holtz Distress inks and Distress stains and oxide inks in both pad and bottled spray bottle form. I have Winsor & Newton drawing inks, and then I have fountain pen inks. Most of my fountain pen inks are the Iroshizuku type. Just quickly, I'm going to show you a few of the types of stamps and the tools that you can use for stamping. Firstly, stamps were traditionally rubber and permanently mounted on a wood block. You can also buy rubber stamps that come with a backing for attaching to a block, but don't come with the block. The most common type of stamp now is acrylic with a sticky backing, and it's usually delivered between 2 sheets of acetate. You don't have to use a stamp block for the stamps that have a sticky backing. Sometimes, if I just want to do something quickly, I just apply ink and press it down with my fingers. You will get a more even result though if you use acrylic stamp blocks like these ones. This is a set of 4 blocks that I purchased from Altenew, who also have beautiful stamps. You can clean all these stamps with mild soapy water. For the archival ink, there is actually a specific cleaner to remove that probably removes similar inks as well, but I don't have any of that remover, so that's why I have stamps that are stained black. While they are stained, they are clean and the stain doesn't transfer onto the page. It just makes the stamp look bad. I have a few ink pads for applying ink straight to the stamp, but I also use this acrylic paintbrush, which you can see has become stained with ink. So don't use a good quality brush for this. I have this brush which has very soft bristles, and I have a sponge applicator, which I won't be using today because I tend to only use it to brush inks around the edges of a page. Finally, I have a small brayer, which is a roller which we can use to apply spray inks to the stamp. A useful tip for using ink pads with your stamps is to touch the pad to the stamp rather than pressing the stamp into the ink pad. This will stop the ink going around the edges of the raised areas and blurring your stamped lines. It gets just the right amount of ink on your stamp for a clean print. This is done with my archival ink pad from Ranger. This is one from my Tim Holtz Distress ink pads. And this is a freebie ink pad that came with one of my stamp sets. This one is okay, and I used it in my 135 GSM Tuck Tea journal without any bleeding. But freebie ink pads that come as part of a set can be a bit hit and miss. Some of them are too dry, some of them just stamp unevenly, or they don't have a good colour, or they might bleed through. You just don't know what you're going to get. The biggest problem with using liquid inks is you don't get an even finish on your stamp. Try to minimise the visible droplets on the surface of the stamp. Grab a paintbrush with acrylic fibres that you don't mind getting stained. Even water-based inks won't wash out completely. Dip it into the ink, remove as much excess liquid as possible, and then paint onto the stamp. You may even need to dab your paintbrush to a paper towel to absorb some of the ink. Another option, if you have a brayer, is to place a few droplets of ink on a piece of acetate and roll your brayer over it several times until there is a good coating on the rubber, then roll the brayer over your stamp surface. I haven't really been able to get good results with this, but I've seen it work for other people. The final option, which is a bit trickier to get a neat and even coverage, is simply to spray your ink onto the acetate and dip the stamp into that ink to colour it and then stamp your page. If doing it this way, you might have to stamp it on another piece of paper first to remove the really wet spots. When I first started losing faith with using ink pads with my stamps, I searched online for alternatives and found out that lots of people use their water-based markers to colour in the stamps, so I thought I'd give this a go. I was able to use my Tombow brush pens in my Nuna journal, which has uncoated 120 GSM paper and had major problems with bleeding, but the stamps used with my Tombow brush pens were fine. To use your Tombow markers, run the marker along the raised surfaces of the stamp, being careful not to fray the marker. I tend to use the side of the marker. Don't worry too much about slipping off the edges, because as long as you don't press the stamp down too hard on the paper, you won't see these. For very fine lines that need to be clear and accurate, take more care. Touch the stamp to your paper, but don't use excessive pressure, as this may blur your lines. Consider doing a practice run on scrap paper so you can learn how much pressure gives you the result you want. I had never considered colouring in my stamp, and the added bonus of this method is that you don't have to restrict yourself to one colour. If you're colouring your stamp, why not actually colour it? I love using my Tombows on my lettering stamps and doing a colour blend between 2 or 3 colours, like I did in my Vivid Scribbles journal. But you could also colour in a picture with different colours. The disadvantage of using a water-based marker is that you have a time limit. At some point, the marker is going to dry on the stamp. So you may not get a good result if the stamp has a large area to colour in, as the first bit you coloured might be dry by the time you've finished colouring the whole picture. Water-based markers are very easy to clean off your stamps with water, leaving them unmarked for the next use. I tried watercolours on my stamps because I had my paints out to prepare this theme in my Nuna journal, and I thought, why not? I'll try it out on an outline stamp today just to see how that works. The trick with using watercolours is to maximise the pigment and reduce runoff by limiting the amount of water you add. Pre-wet your paints in your palette so they're wet but there's no puddles on top. If you're using paint straight from the tube, dab a bit out in your palette, but don't add any water at this stage. Wet your brush, but remove all drips and apply a little paint, making sure lots of colour gets onto your brush. Apply the paint to the surface of the stamp, avoiding any water collecting around the edges of the raised surfaces. This is to make sure the lines are as accurate as possible when you press down the stamp. Excess water will make the paint spread around the stamp and make it look messy. As for water-based markers, you can blend colours, you can paint the stamp with multiple colours, and it's easy to wash off just with water. There are other options that get a bit messy that I'm not going to show you today, like using water-soluble oil pastels or even bleach, especially good on coloured or black paper, but be careful. I'm keen to try some Versamagic chalk inks in my bullet journal, but I also like the idea of not spending a whole lot of money buying different colours in ink pads and getting more use out of my Tombow markers and my watercolours instead. Don't forget to like my video, subscribe to my channel and watch a few of my other videos. I've recently done one that goes through the options for writing with pens on washi tape, and I've also done a very thorough review of using watercolours in your bullet journal. See ya!